lesson.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm going to be a little cautious at the start because we're using this new microphone for the first time, and I don't want to blow out the speakers because I barely need a microphone to start with. So, good morning.
Good morning.
How's that?
Good morning. Sounds good.
All right. I've just for note, I have terrible hearing. Just years and years of going to concerts and working around speakers and things like that. It's just like I can't tell if there's actually anything coming out of it. So thank you for those who are helping me out with it today. A long time ago in India, we're gonna do a quick little educational lesson. Really quick, does anybody know what the Cobra Effect is? Anybody heard of this? Fantastic! You're gonna learn something new today. Isn't that great? Learn something new every day. So they're looking a little unsure in the back. So it's the second dial, I guess. 8? Alright, it's working.
Sounds good.
Move it up a little bit. Okay, so a long time ago in India, they had a really big problem with cobras. Cobras were kind of the leading cause of death. And so the British, who were kind of in charge of things at the time, the British government implemented a cobra bounty. And so if you were to snuff out a cobra and bring it to the government, they would pay you money for it. Now, some quick-thinking entrepreneurs got a great idea, because hunting random cobras are dangerous. Now, raising them yourself, that's a way to make money. And so people started raising pens and pens of cobras. And as soon as they grew into full size, they would kill them, take them to the government, and they would get their money for them. Now, the government catches wind of this, and there's only one logical decision. They have to stop paying money for this. So now all these quick-thinking entrepreneurs are left with hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of deadly, deadly cobras. And since it's dangerous to try and kill them, they release them into the population. So the Cobra Effect is when you attempt to solve a problem and wind up making it worse. Cobra Effect. There you go. That's your random factoid for the week. People are complicated at best, and they are flawed at worst. Now, I know this for two reasons. One of them is because when I was typing my notes and I typed out the sentence, people are flawed, I misspelled the word flawed. And my arch enemy, that little red squiggle under the word popped up. I hate that guy so much. That little inanimate red line that pops up anytime you type a word wrong. Him and I have a history. And so yeah, people are flawed. That's one of the reasons. The other reason I know that people are flawed is when Jesus was down here and he was doing his ministry. He's doing his famous Sermon on the Mount, and there's all sorts of amazing information that comes out of that. Like, love your neighbor as yourself, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And we are such a flawed people that those people sat by and they listened to Jesus and said, wow, that is some next level stuff right there. Not being judgmental towards people and loving your neighbor as yourself? I hadn't thought of that on my own. That's how I know people are flawed, because we had to have Jesus come down and explain that to us as people. That maybe we should tone it down a little and be nice to one another. We are in the book of Genesis. We're kind of going through it. So we're in Genesis chapter 4. Eric did a really, really good job teaching out of Genesis 3, talking about kind of the fall of mankind. The thing I always comment on the Bible is it's so data heavy that you have to kind of breeze through sections really quick. And so from our perspective, humanity is on the ground for about 90 seconds before we drop the ball and doom the rest of the species for all eternity. So good job, guys. We made it 90 whole seconds. Now, unfortunately, that sentiment continues in Genesis chapter 4. As we've learned from the scripture reading, Adam and Eve have their parents to Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel have the good old-fashioned, very first sibling rivalry. I love my younger brother to death, but we are definitely rivals at times. We were out taking his children duck pin bowling one day. Duck pin bowling is where the balls are super tiny and they have bumpers, so like the kids can't mess up. We got super competitive over that, just between me and him. We got really vindictively competitive over duck pin bowling. So siblings just have something in them that kind of like trigger this sort of rivalry. Now, of course, Cain and Abel, a lot worse than duck and bowling. It's one of those things where they are presenting sacrifices to God, and Cain just isn't doing what he needs to do to kind of sacrifice as good as Abel is. And it's not that he doesn't have the resources available, it's just that he's not necessarily putting in the work. And so God kind of lectures him on it and says, you can overcome this. This is something that you can definitely get past. Now, unfortunately, in Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 8, kind of just after the section that was read earlier. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So verse 8, like I said, Bible's a data-heavy book. There's a lot of information we have to get across very quickly because we're literally covering eons of history. And in one verse, the first death, the first murder has occurred, and it's kind of what I like to refer to as the world's shortest episode of CSI. Because this murder has taken place, and then in verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? Good job, Cain. Way to cover up for it. Because it's not bad enough that you've gone out into the field and you've grown jealous of your brother and you've attacked him, and whether by accident or whether on purpose, whatever it was, you have killed him. Not only that, the first thing that comes to mind when God shows up is, I know, I'm going to lie. That'll get me out of this jam. Good job, Cain. I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? The Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. So, just to clarify really quickly, Adam and Eve have eaten from the forbidden tree. And as a result, they were cast out of the garden. They were cast out of the perfect place. Of course, we're going to do that with a new microphone. They were cast out of the perfect place, the place where they did not have to labor, they did not have to worry, there was no necessary responsibility, everything was provided. So now they must go out into the world and they must toil and they must work in order to survive. And they bring up children. And those children become of age where they can work in the fields and they can work as shepherds and they can work at the harvest. And then one brother kills the other, and now he is cursed and sent out to where he can't even work the ground anymore. It's one of those things where, pardon me, I'm terribly sorry. It's one of those things where a bad situation really has gotten worse. Because the reason I bring up the Cobra Effect example this morning is because I want to talk about the idea of how flawed we are as people. And there's a knee-jerk reaction when we are criticized as people. When one person says to another, you were flawed. Like, even if it's just a kind of an arbitrary fact, there's a thing where in your head you start going through all the good things you do and all the amazing things you do, and you're a good person, and you're nice, and you're loving, and you're a good family member, or you're a good spouse, or whatever it is. And yes, those things are true. Not debating that in any way, shape, or form. But we, as a species, pretty much from the beginning of time, are flawed. Because of the events that take place in the book of Genesis. It is just a thing. Because in the Cobra Effect example, the government is legitimately trying to reduce the population of cobras so that people will stop dying. That's a good, honorable goal to which someone said, hey, there's a way to make money off of this. People are flawed. It's just one of those things. Whether it's in big ways, whether it's in small ways, there's just something about us as people that we try and fix situations to our advantage. Cain kills Abel. And there's not like a lot. The reason I kind of made the quippy remark about the world's shortest episode of CSI is because in those police procedural shows, there's like an hour of like investigating suspects and going to the lab and testing theories. And God shows up, and Abel is dead, and Cain is standing there, and God knows exactly what happened. And still, Cain thinks, I'm going to lie my way out of this situation. And so Cain is set forth to be a restless wanderer. And Cain says to the Lord in verse 13, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The consequences of our actions, from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel, all the way up to today, to what Jeff was talking about at the communion table this morning, the idea that there are people who are flawed, that even the people who followed Jesus himself, the people who studied at the feet of the Master, who was there when he performed miracles, when they saw what had happened, they were there on the day that he was resurrected. Those people themselves were not perfect. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't have anything figured out. And so humanity, pretty much from the beginning of time, is presented with a big question. How do we fix this problem? What do we do to get out of this mess that we're in? And I'm not talking about just Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel. I'm talking about us as people. Because for all those good, honorable things that you enlist for me, for all those things that you enlist inside your head, for every single one of those things, there's also instances where we have fallen short as people. Because that is what we are dealing with as a species. And so for a long time, sacrifices were made. Sacrifice, 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 all the time. Sacrifices all the time in order to make up for these shortcomings. Those generations that were born afterwards, as they're bringing up and they're being educated, they're being told about how the world is. Because by the time we get to our generation, children grow up and they learn that the world is a wildly unfair place and that things don't always work out the way you want for them, and it's just this kind of weird thing. But in those early generations, I couldn't imagine one would be like, so, things used to be perfect all the time, and then we kind of messed it up. Like, that's got to be kind of a rough upbringing right there. It's like, hey, you know all that hard work you're doing in the field? Sorry. And so Cain goes out into the world and he just has to deal. He has to continue to exist. He has to live with the consequences of his actions. God has made his personal assurance that he would not be murdered. And so he just has to go out into the world in this even worse circumstance somehow that he was already in. And he just has to kind of deal with it. Much in the same way that we as people go out into the world and we have to seek answers. We have to answer the big, tough questions. How do I get out of the circumstances that I'm in? Well, the thing we've learned from Cain is lying your way out of your problems is not going to make them go away, at least not long term. The thing we learned from the Cobra Effect is, yeah, that short-term solution seems really great and really profitable, and then things get a whole lot worse. And so, how do we get out of this situation? Well, that question gets answered every single week when we're here at church. And it's such an important answer that it's not redundant, it's not exhausting, it's not pointless to repeat it over and over and over again. No, it's a reinforcement of our own faith. The sacrifice that Christ has made for us. that sacrifice that was made so that generations and generations and generations later, there's an answer to the question, how do I get out of this mess that I'm in? And it doesn't require literal physical sacrifice. It doesn't require real messy, nitty-gritty sacrifice. It simply requires this commitment. It requires this ritual where, yes, we die to our old selves and we are reborn again in the name of Christ, in the name of the sacrifice that He made for each and every one of us. And so, for all the historical figures of the Bible, for the Adams and Eves and the Cains and Abels and Moses and the disciples and the apostles and whoever else it may be, we see ourselves in their stories. And that is why their stories are being told. The reason that the first murder is recorded is because it's an important story to tell. It's important to tell because it talks about what we are driven to do when we separate ourselves so far from God. And it's one of those things where it's just one verse. In one verse, Abel is alive. And in the next verse, Abel is dead. Abel is gone from this world. And it's one of those unfortunate stories where when you really stop and you really reflect on that moment when you recognize that Cain has pushed himself so far that he can't go back to the way things were. I do believe this. I do believe that nobody in this room is a murderer. And I'm really hoping that's true. But it's one of those things where we have made mistakes in our life where the outcome of the mistake that was made is our circumstances are irreparably changed. Whatever mistakes we have made in the past, there has been something in our lives that once that mistake has been made, you stop and you reflect on it and you go, I can work all day and I can work all night and I can build and I can build and I can build, but I will never, ever, ever be able to fix this bridge. And it's unfortunate. And it's one of those things where that's why, for the extreme example of Cain and Abel, for the extreme example of, yes, we are not killers in here, but we do recognize something in that story that belongs to each and every one of us. We do recognize that there is a mistake in our lives, that there's something that we cannot fix ourselves. But the point is that we don't have to fix it ourselves. We're not responsible for that. It's one of those things where it does not fall on us through our strengths and our weaknesses and our flaws and our victories. It does not fall to us to fix these mistakes. That mistake was already corrected many, 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 many years ago. And the solution to our problem is simply lying in front of us. It's there in front of us for us to take. And that's the thing that's most empowering to us about the sacrifice that Christ has made for us. To recognize that no matter what we have done as people, there is a solution to our problems. And it's there. And it's in front of you. And it's free from the taking. That is empowering. Greater than the way that the story of Cain and Abel is tragic. The idea that the answer to our problems is simply right there for the taking. The fall of man leads to sufferings of every single conceivable caliber. The fall of mankind leads to anything that's ever been wrong in your life traces back to, no pun intended, the genesis of the book of Genesis. That's why it's called Genesis. It's the beginning. Actually, I'm sorry, the pun was totally intended. I don't know what I was thinking. The pun was 100% intended. But all of the shortcomings that we have as people trace back to that point. And then, generations after that, God sent his only Son to die on the cross for us, so that our sins, our mistakes, our shortcomings could be forgiven. And that is why we tell that story in different ways each and every week. Through different passages of Scripture, through different times, through different generations, we continue to tell that story. And much like in the way that we see ourselves in the story of Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve, we see the necessity of why that sacrifice had to be made. We see ourselves in those stories. We like to kid ourselves. We like to say, I am beyond temptation. I would not eat from that tree. I would be diligent and I would do a good job and I would not make mistakes. And I say those sentences in much in the way that Cain tried to cover up his mistake. I am a liar when I say those things. Because we don't like to think ourselves as weak or helpless or incompetent. But it's one of those things where, regardless of our flaws as people, we understand the sacrifice that has been made for us. The sacrifice that can set those shortcomings aside. There's one other way I know that people are flawed. There's just one last way. And it's the fact that Jesus Christ came down, he grew up, he lived in this body, in this world, and he walked among us, and he gave forth wisdom and information. He performed miracles. He taught greater than any other teacher ever would again. He got up and he did his Sermon on the Mount, and he taught us the Lord's Prayer. And after all of this, after everything was said and done, people were so terrified by the notion of what Jesus represented that they arrested him, they put him falsely on trial, and they executed him. That's what we did to the being, to the God, to the man that came down and said, hey guys, let's be good to one another. Let's love our neighbors as ourselves. Let's be the best that we can be. And mankind looked at that and said, well, not all of us, obviously, but the people in power looked at that and they rejected it and they executed it. That's how I know people are flawed. But more importantly than that, Jesus saw the good in the world. And his love for us is so infinite. And the word infinite, the word unlimited, it gets tossed around, it gets used casually sometimes. We're very hyperbolic in nature. This is the worst day ever. This is the best day ever. We're so hyperbolic in nature. But Christ's love is literally so infinite that he looked at all the flaws in the world. He looked at those who falsely accused him. He looked at those who put him on that cross. And he went through with it anyways. He decided it was worth going through. It was worth taking on the burdens of every single person that existed and every single person that would exist from there to the end of time. And he looked at us as a people and he said, those people are worth dying for. And so be empowered and be strengthened by that message. The message that, yes, we as people have a lot to work on. We have a lot of things that we need to work on as people to become better people, to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be, but with the knowledge that no matter how far we get on that journey, we're never going to be the best. We're never going to be perfect. We're never going to be... That's not the attainable goal. But the attainable goal is to live in the way that Christ wants us to live and to just do the best that we can each and every day and realize that there are shortcomings and there are bad days and there are good days and there are accomplished goals and there are failed goals. And to know that in the end, the only thing that matters is that we live in a manner that is pleasing to God. We live in a way that is representative of the way that his son lived. Through those words, love your neighbor as yourself, do unto others, all that good stuff. And to recognize that in the end, it doesn't matter how flawed we are as people, the responsibility and the burden does not fall to us. But the sacrifice has already been made, and the sacrifice, that gift is there for the taking. If you're here today and you have not accepted that gift, know that it is freely available right this very second. It's available right now. That's the great thing about it. It's not, as much as I love Amazon.com, getting things in 2 days, getting things in 2 hours, that's great. But what I'm talking about is something that's available right now. If you're here today and you've already accepted that gift, but there's a shortcoming, there's a barrier, there's something in your life that's created a wall around you, let's break down that wall. Let's do what we can. And prayers are available now. Prayers are available anytime. We are available as a body of believers to help you through that journey as we are encouraged to do. And so if you're here today, I ask you to meditate and to think on these things as we stand and sing the Song of Invitation.